Today in this video, I'm going to talk about the maintenance of calcium and phosphate homeostasis in our body. Okay, now there are mainly three organs which are responsible for maintaining calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Okay, the first one is the intestine. The second one is the bone, and the third one is the kidney. Okay, so these are the three organs that are responsible for maintaining calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Now there are also three hormones, okay, which act on these organs and they help in maintaining the calcium level. Okay, so the first hormone is vitamin D. The second hormone is parathyroid hormone, and the third hormone is calcitonin. Okay, so these are the three organs and these are the three hormones which helps in maintaining calcium and phosphate homeostasis in our body. Now first, let's talk about the role of intestine in maintenance of calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Okay, so the role of intestine. Okay, now in intestine, as I mentioned earlier, there are three hormones which are responsible for maintaining calcium and phosphate homeostasis. But in case of intestine, okay, calcitonin, it does not have any function, okay, because there are no any receptors of calcitonin in the intestine, so no function of calcitonin. Now in case of parathyroid hormone, it has indirect action. Okay, indirect action. How? This hormone will stimulate the enzyme 1-alpha hydroxylase. 1-alpha hydroxylase, and this enzyme is responsible for activating vitamin D. I've already made a video on vitamin D. If you have not watched it, make sure to watch it. So parathyroid hormone will stimulate 1-alpha hydroxylase, which will activate vitamin D, and vitamin D is the major hormone which will maintain calcium and phosphate homeostasis in the intestine. So vitamin D role of vitamin D in the intestine is calcium and phosphate absorption. Okay, so vitamin D will help in absorption of calcium and phosphate in the intestine. Now here I have drawn a very simple sketch of intestinal cells. This is let's say this is intestinal lumen. So these are the enterocytes. This is the nucleus. This space right here, this is the interstitial space, and this is the blood vessel. Okay, so we have the lumen, we have the enterocytes, we have the interstitial space behind the enterocytes, and then blood vessels. Now how does vitamin D helps in the calcium absorption? Now after we intake calcium in our diet, this calcium will go into the lumen, right? So here we have the calcium here. Calcium will move into the lumen. Now we need to take this calcium from the lumen to the blood vessels, and that is done by vitamin D. So here comes the vitamin D. Okay, vitamin D will arrive from the blood. So I'll just make a dot here. This is the vitamin D, let's say. So it has its receptor here on the enterocytes. So this is the vitamin D receptor. Now vitamin D will come and it will bind with its receptor and it will form vitamin D and receptor complex. Okay, so it will form this receptor and vitamin D complex. Now this complex will move to the nucleus of the enterocytes, and in the nucleus this complex will act on the DNA. Okay, so this is the DNA. This receptor complex will act on the DNA, and we know that DNA forms mRNA, right? And mRNA helps in protein synthesis, right? Okay, so vitamin D acting on the DNA will create some proteins. Now these are the proteins which are responsible for the transport of calcium from the lumen to the blood vessels. Okay, now you say this calcium is into the lumen, right? So first we need to take this calcium inside of this cell. Okay, so here we have the calcium in the lumen. Now one of the protein which is formed by the action of vitamin D on the enterocytes is this calcium channel here. Okay, so one of the protein is this one. This calcium channel will take in calcium from the lumen into the enterocytes. Here we have the calcium. The name of this calcium channel is TRPV6 or transient receptor potential vanilloid 6. Okay, remember 6 because there is another receptor TRPV5 in case of kidney. So this channel is TRPV6 and it will intake calcium from the lumen into the enterocytes. Now inside the enterocytes we need to take this calcium from the apical side to the basal side. Okay, so here is another protein, this one, which is known as calbindin. Okay, and as the name suggests, this will bind with the calcium, so hence the name calbindin. So this protein will bind with lots of calcium ions and will take these from this to this side. Okay, on the basal sides. Now on the basal sides, now we need to throw these calcium ions from this cell into the interstitial space. Okay, so there are another two proteins, one here and another here, which will throw out the calcium from the enterocytes into the interstitial space. Okay, so the first protein right here, this is calcium proton pump. So this protein is calcium proton pump. It has another name which is slightly complex. It is PMCA1B. PMCA means plasma membrane calcium pump 1B. Okay, so this is the name of this pump right here. So this is the calcium proton pump. So what will it do? It will throw out the calcium here and it will take in proton just to maintain that balance. Okay, so this is another protein which is formed by the vitamin D. Okay, and this one right here is sodium calcium exchanger. Okay, so what does this protein do? It will throw out calcium and it will take in sodium. Okay, so hence the name sodium calcium exchanger. So, and this is another protein right here. So these are the four proteins. First one is the TRPV6, second one is the calbindin. Here we have calcium proton pump and here we have sodium calcium exchanger. Now that the calcium is in the interstitial space, it will diffuse into the blood vessel like this. So that's how the calcium is transported from the lumen into the blood vessels with the help of vitamin D. So this is the role of vitamin D in the intestine. Now for the role of vitamin D in phosphate absorption, here I have again drawn this sketch of intestine. We have the lumen, the enterocytes, we have the blood vessel here, we have the interstitial space. This is the nucleus of the enterocyte. The basic mechanism is same. Okay, so the vitamin D comes in here, it will bind to its receptor, it will form a receptor complex, and this complex will move on to the nucleus and will bind to the DNA, and then DNA will ultimately form proteins. Now the proteins in this case are slightly different. So the first protein here helps in movement of phosphate. So here we have phosphate from the lumen into the cell. Okay, so first protein here is sodium phosphate transporter. So this is the sodium phosphate transporter. So it will transport phosphate along with the sodium here. So here we have the phosphate. Okay, now here is another protein right here which will throw out phosphate from enterocytes into the interstitial space, but this protein is unknown, so I'll just make a question mark here. We don't know the name of this protein. So now the protein is into the interstitial space, it will just diffuse into the blood vessel like that. As lots of sodium are coming inside the enterocytes, so to maintain the concentration of sodium into the enterocytes, there is one channel here which is sodium potassium pump. So this channel will throw out sodium and will take in potassium, so just to maintain the concentration of sodium inside the enterocytes. And this pump is also formed by the influence of vitamin D into the enterocytes. So this is the role of vitamin D in phosphate absorption in intestine. Now coming to the role of bones in calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Okay, calcium and phosphate are stored in the bone. They are stored in the form of hydroxyapatite crystals. Okay, calcium and phosphate are stored in the bone in the form of hydroxyapatite crystals. I can even write its chemical structure: calcium and phosphate, calcium, and here we have phosphate, and hydroxy means I'll add one hydroxy group here. Okay, so I'll start off with calcium. I'll write 10 here. 10 minus 4 is 6, and 6 minus 4 is 2. Easy, right? So hydroxyapatite crystals present in the bone along with type 1 collagen. Okay, so hydroxyapatite crystals along with type 1 collagen, these two will form the extracellular matrix of the bone, and this will provide strength and stabilization to the bone. Okay, now 3 hormones that are involved in maintaining calcium and phosphate homeostasis in the bones are vitamin D, the parathyroid hormone, and the calcitonin. Okay, so these 3 hormones act on the bone. Now, what are the role of these hormones? First, I'm going to talk about the vitamin D hormone. Vitamin D, it has its receptor. Okay, here I have drawn a very simple sketch of a microscopic structure of bone. So I've taken, let's say this is a bone, and I've magnified this part over here. So these are the few cells that are present in the bone. This giant cell is the osteoclast cell. These cells are the osteoblast cells, and these are the osteocytes. Okay, so these are the 3 cells that help in the growth and development of the bone. Okay, so vitamin D will have its receptor in this cell, the osteoblast cell. Okay, vitamin D comes here, it will bind to its receptor in the osteoblast cells. Now various intracellular cascades will go on, as I have explained earlier, and these osteoblast cells will produce 2 paracrine factors. 2 paracrine factors, they are interleukin 6 and rank L. Okay, so these 2 paracrine factors are produced by the vitamin D when the vitamin D binds to its receptor on the osteoblast cells. Okay, now these 2 factors will stimulate the osteoclast cells. Okay, So that's one function of vitamin D, production of interleukin 6, RANGL, and they will stimulate the osteoclast cells. And another thing what it does is it will produce another substance called MCSF. CSF means colony stimulating factor. I'm not sure what this M refers to, okay, but what it does is it will convert immature osteoclast, these osteoclast precursors. So let's say these are the immature osteoclast precursors into mature osteoclast precursors. Let's say these are the mature one, okay. So MCSF will convert immature osteoclast precursors into mature osteoclast precursors, and these mature osteoclast precursors will diffuse and they will form this multinucleated giant osteoclast cells, okay. So vitamin D also helps in the maturation of osteoclast precursors. So that's the function of vitamin D in the bone. Now talking about the parathyroid hormone, similar as that of vitamin D, will have its receptor on the osteoblast cells. So here's the parathyroid hormone, it will come here and it will bind to its receptor on the osteoblast cells, and then osteoblast cells will produce the same paracrine factors, interleukin 6 and RANGL, and this will stimulate the osteoclast cells. That's the function of parathyroid hormone. Now, as you can see here, both of these hormones, they are stimulating the osteoclast cells, and what osteoclast cells does is it will destroy the bone here, okay. So it will eat up this bone over here. The function of osteoclast cells is to destroy the bone, actually destroy the old bones, okay. So vitamin D, why it does this? Because it needs to create a new environment for the deposition of new bone, okay. So it helps in the growth of the bone. You know, our bones in our body are under constant turnover. The old bones needs to be destroyed and new bones needs to be formed, and to provide space for the new bones to deposit, vitamin D will create a space by stimulating osteoclast cells and destroying these old bones. Now, these osteoblast cells, their function is to deposit calcium and phosphate into this space, right? So this blank space over here, this space is eaten up by the osteoclast cells. Now these osteoblast cells will arrive into this space and they will secrete calcium and phosphate, and they will deposit at this space right here, and they will convert into osteocyte, okay. So osteoblast cells, when they are surrounded by their own secretions, the calcium and the phosphate, they convert into osteocyte cells. The real function of osteocyte cells is to transfer the calcium ion which are present on inner part of the bone onto the growing surface, okay. So if this area of the bone is growing, then they will transfer this calcium to this growing part of the bone, okay. So these are the function of the cells. Now vitamin D and parathyroid hormone. Now coming to calcitonin. So as you can see here, vitamin D and parathyroid hormone, they both stimulate osteoclast cells. Osteoclast cells destroys this bone, okay. And we know that bone is a storage form of calcium and phosphate. So as osteoclast destroys this bone, there is release of calcium and phosphate into the blood. So the blood level of calcium and phosphate will increase. So these two hormones will increase the level of calcium and phosphate in the blood. Now calcitonin hormone does just exactly opposite to this hormone, okay. It has its receptor on this osteoclast cells. So calcitonin has its receptor on the osteoclast cells. It will bind to its receptor here and it will inhibit the action, okay. So osteoclast cells will be inhibited by the calcitonin, whereas vitamin D and parathyroid hormone will stimulate the osteoclast cells, okay. So that's all. That's how the bone plays in calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Now coming to the role of kidney in calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Here you can see I've drawn a very simple sketch of the nephron, kidney nephron. This is the glomerulus here. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. We have thick ascending loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting tubule. Okay. Now you see these arteries flowing through the glomerulus. Through these arteries, calcium is filtered into the glomerulus. Now let's say the amount of calcium filtered is considered as 100%. Okay. So let's consider the amount of filtered calcium as 100%. Now out of this 100% of filtered calcium, 65% is reabsorbed through the proximal convoluted tubule. 65% through the proximal convoluted tubule, 25% through the thick ascending loop of Henle, 8% through the distal convoluted tubule. Now if you add all these, it becomes 98%, 2% remaining, 1% is reabsorbed through the collecting tubule, and remaining 1% is excreted. Okay, so lots of calcium that were filtered through the glomerulus are reabsorbed. Okay, so the role of kidney is to reabsorb the filtered calcium. Okay, so the hormones that are acting on the kidney are, number one is vitamin D. Okay, so the vitamin D helps in the reabsorption of kidney, and the mechanism of how it does that is same as that of GIT. Okay, so the mechanism of absorption of calcium by the vitamin D is same as that of GIT. So if I bring out this picture here, so this was the how vitamin D acts on the gastroenterocytes. The whole mechanism of vitamin D coming here, binding to its receptor, it form complex and act on the nucleus and all these proteins that help in the transport of calcium from the lumen to the intestine is same in the kidney as well. The only difference is here. Okay, the TRPV6 channel, which was found in the gastroenterocytes, it's not TRPV6, now it becomes TRPV5. Okay, so 5 in case of kidney. Okay, so that's the role of vitamin D. Now coming to the second hormone, the parathyroid hormone. The first function of parathyroid hormone is to activate the 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme. Okay, this enzyme is present in the proximal convoluted tubule of the nephron, and this enzyme helps in activating vitamin D. So yeah, parathyroid hormone activate 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme, and this enzyme will activate the vitamin D. Another is it also helps in the calcium reabsorption. Okay, parathyroid hormone helps in calcium reabsorption, and one very important thing to note down here is, although it helps in calcium reabsorption, it will decrease phosphate reabsorption. Okay, parathyroid hormone will decrease phosphate reabsorption in the kidney, or you can say it will increase phosphate excretion in the kidney. That's the role of parathyroid hormone. Now coming to the third hormone, which is the calcitonin. Calcitonin hormone it is produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. Now we know that calcitonin hormone is produced when the blood level of calcium and phosphate will increase. Okay, so when so this hormone will ultimately have to decrease the level of calcium in the blood, so it will decrease calcium and phosphate reabsorption. Okay, this hormone decreases calcium and phosphate level in the blood by decreasing calcium and phosphate reabsorption from the kidney. So that's how the kidney plays in calcium and phosphate homeostasis. Thank you.